Hello there, and welcome to the HistSleep channel. Tonight, we are going to step away from the loud, chaotic world of the present and drift back into the velvet shadows of the past. We are entering a world of heavy silk curtains, flickering candlelight, and secrets that were never meant to leave the stone walls of the palace. We are going to explore the lives of women who wore crowns of gold, but carried hearts of lead. But before we begin our journey into these forbidden corridors of history, I would love it if you could take a moment to subscribe to this channel and give this video a like. It truly helps these quiet stories find their way to those who are looking for a bit of peace at the end of a long day. And I'm always so curious to know, where in the world are you right now? Is it a cold night where you are, or perhaps a warm, humid evening? Are you listening from the comfort of your bed, or maybe you're just resting your eyes for a moment? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one, and they are a wonderful reminder of this quiet community we are building together. Now, settle in. Adjust your pillows, pull up your blanket, and let the weight of your body sink into the bed. Let's talk about the hidden price of a crown. To the outside world, the life of a queen or a princess has always been the ultimate dream. We see the portraits, the stiff, regal poses, the diamonds that catch the light, and the robes made of the finest ermine and lace. We imagine a life of endless banquets, of bowing servants, and of power that could move mountains. But if you look closer at those portraits, if you look past the jewelry and the expensive pigments, you start to see something else in their eyes. A certain stillness. A solitude that no amount of gold could fill. You see, for a royal woman in history, her body was rarely her own. She was a vessel for a dynasty, a walking treaty between two nations, a piece on a political chessboard. From the moment she was born, her life was a series of expectations. Who she would marry, how she would speak, how many sons she would provide. There was very little room for something as inconvenient as love. Imagine for a moment living in a palace with 1,000 rooms, yet never having a single moment truly to yourself. Every letter you write is intercepted. Every whisper to a lady-in-waiting is repeated in the hallways. Every glance you give to a handsome guard or a visiting count is measured and judged. The walls of a palace are thick, but they have ears. And in those corridors, a single mistake, a single moment of following your heart instead of your duty, could lead to a scandal that would echo for centuries. Tonight, we aren't going to talk about the wars these women started, or the laws they signed. Instead, we are going to talk about their hearts. We are going to talk about the secret letters, the midnight meetings in the palace gardens, and the men who offered them the one thing their kings could not. A sense of being seen. A sense of being human. Think of the cold, drafty hallways of Windsor, or the gilded halls of Versailles. Beyond the smell of beeswax and expensive perfume, there was often the scent of desperation. The desperation to be loved for who they were, not for the title they held. We will meet women like Princess Margaret, who found herself caught between the ancient rules of the church and the man she truly adored. We will travel to the French court to find Marie Antoinette, a girl who was married off to a boy she didn't know, and who sought comfort in the arms of a Swedish count. These stories aren't just about scandals. They are about the human condition. They are about the tension between what the world demands of us and what our souls truly crave. As we move through these 3 hours tonight, I want you to let the details of their lives wash over you like a slow, rhythmic tide. Don't worry about remembering the dates or the names of every duke and duchess. Just feel the atmosphere. The sound of a carriage on a cobblestone path in the middle of the night. the scratch of a quill on parchment as a queen writes a letter she knows she must burn. History likes to remember these women as symbols, as icons of virtue or as villains of excess. But they were neither. They were simply people, trapped in a system that demanded they be perfect. And perfection is a very lonely thing. When we talk about secret love scandals, we aren't looking for gossip in the way the modern world does. We are looking for the cracks in the armor. We are looking for the moments when the mask of royalty slipped and a real woman appeared. A woman who was lonely, a woman who was bored, a woman who was deeply, hopelessly in love with someone she was forbidden to have. In the centuries that we will cover tonight, from the medieval courts to the modern era, the theme remains the same. The crown is heavy, not just because of the gold, but because of the weight of the millions of people watching you. To love in secret was the only way to love at all. To have a secret was to have a private world, a small corner of existence that the state could not touch. So, as we prepare to move into our first story, let go of your own worries. Let go of the things you have to do tomorrow. Let go of the noise in your head. We are entering the quiet world of the past. The candles are being lit, the servants are retiring to their quarters, and the palace is finally still. In this stillness, the secrets begin to breathe. Can you hear the rustle of a silk dress in a dark hallway? Can you hear the muffled sound of a horse's hooves as someone arrives at the back gate? These are the sounds of history's heartbeats. Tonight is a long journey. We have 3 hours together. There is no rush. We have all the time in the world to explore these lives. If you fall asleep during the first story, that's perfectly fine. These stories are here to keep you company in the dark, to give your mind a gentle place to rest. The hidden price of a crown was often silence. But tonight, we are going to break that silence, very softly. We are going to listen to the whispers that have been buried for hundreds of years. Are you ready? Good. Take one more deep breath. In and out. Let us begin with a story from a time not so long ago, but a world that feels like a distant dream. Let us go to the post-war halls of Buckingham Palace, where a young princess is about to learn that her heart is no longer hers to give. The year is 1953. The air in London is thick with the excitement of a new era. A new queen has been crowned. Elizabeth II. But while the world looks at the queen, our story begins with her younger sister, Princess Margaret. A woman whose life would become a blueprint for the struggle between royal duty and the desire for a simple, honest love. London in 1953 was a city suspended between two worlds. The gray, weary shadows of the post-war years were slowly being washed away by the bright, hopeful light of a new Elizabethan era. The coronation of Queen Elizabeth II had filled the streets with flags and cheers, but behind the heavy, velvet curtains of Buckingham Palace, a different, much quieter story was unfolding. It was a story of a younger sister, a woman of fire and spirit, who was finding that the walls of her gold-leafed world were closing in on her. Princess Margaret. Margaret was the charcoal to her sister's diamond, vibrant, witty, and often unpredictable. But as the world celebrated the new queen, Margaret was grappling with a secret that would soon shake the very foundations of the British monarchy. She had fallen in love. Not with a foreign prince, not with a duke of ancient lineage, but with a man who worked within the palace itself. Group Captain Peter Townsend. Peter was a hero of the Battle of Britain, a man of quiet dignity and steady nerves. To Margaret, He was more than just an equerry to the king, he was a sanctuary. In his presence, she wasn't just a royal highness to be curated and displayed, she was simply Margaret. But Peter Townsend carried a heavy burden in the eyes of the 1950s establishment. He was a commoner, he was 15 years her senior, and most unforgivably, he was a divorced man. Imagine the hushed atmosphere of the palace corridors during those long, rainy London afternoons. The scent of floor wax and aged timber, the rhythmic ticking of 100 clocks, and the two of them, passing each other with nothing more than a stolen glance. A look that held 1,000 unspoken words. For Margaret, the desperation was beginning to set in. She lived in a world where every move was a performance for the state, and yet, the only thing she truly wanted was the one thing the state forbade. Their love was discovered in the most subtle of ways, a tiny gesture that went unnoticed by many but screamed volumes to those who knew the rules. During the coronation, Margaret was seen casually brushing a piece of fluff off Peter's uniform. It was a moment of pure, domestic intimacy, a slip of the royal mask. In that single second, the press caught the scent of a scandal, and the machinery of the government began to turn against her. The Prime Minister, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the grey men in suits who guarded the traditions of the crown, they all looked at this young woman not with sympathy, but as a problem to be solved. They spoke of duty, a word that in the royal dictionary often means the death of personal happiness. Margaret was told that if she chose Peter, she would have to renounce everything. Her titles, her income, and her place in the family she loved. Think of the psychological weight of that choice, drifting through the quiet rooms of Clarence House, staring out at the mist rising from St. James's Park. The loneliness of a princess is a specific kind of ache. It is the knowledge that your life belongs to millions of people you will never meet, but it doesn't belong to you. Margaret spent her nights in a cloud of cigarette smoke, listening to jazz records, trying to drown out the silence of a life dictated by others. The pressure was relentless. For 2 long years, they were kept apart by distance and decree, hoping that time would wither their feelings. But silence only makes the heart louder. When they were finally reunited, the world was watching. Every newspaper in America and Europe carried their photos, debating whether a princess should be allowed to follow her heart. But the 1950s was not an age of romantic rebellion, it was an age of structure. In October 1955, the tension finally broke. Margaret sat at her desk, the same desk where she had written so many letters to Peter, and drafted a statement that would end her youth. She announced to the world that she would not be marrying Peter Townsend. She said she had reached this decision alone, mindful of the Church's teachings and her duty to the Commonwealth. But those who knew her saw the light go out in her eyes that day. Peter left the country, and Margaret stayed behind, tucked away in the shadows of the throne. She eventually married another, but the ghost of what could have been never truly left her. The scandal changed her. She became the rebel royal, the one who stayed up too late, the one who laughed too loud, the one who seemed to be searching for something she knew she would never find again. As you listen to the sound of my voice, let yourself feel the stillness of those palace rooms. The cold marble, the vast, empty galleries, the weight of a crown that was never even hers to wear, yet governed every breath she took. Margaret's story is the ultimate introduction to the secret loves of royal women, because it shows us the cost of the cage. It reminds us that even in a world of palaces, the most valuable thing any human can possess is the freedom to choose who they love. The era of Margaret and Peter was a turning point, a crack in the old world. But as we let their story fade into the gentle darkness, we realize that this struggle is as old as time itself. The heart does not care for borders, or titles, or the laws of kings. It only knows what it needs to survive the night. Now, let the image of 1950s London dissolve. Let the sound of the vintage jazz and the clinking of teacups fade away. We are moving further back in time now, leaving the rain-slicked streets of England for the golden, sun-drenched gardens of another century. We are traveling to a place where the air smells of lavender and conspiracy, and where another woman is about to risk everything for a love that the world will never understand. We are going to the heart of the French Revolution, to the private chambers of a queen who was loved by many, but truly known by only one. Take a slow, deep breath, and let the history wash over you. We are moving into the world of Marie Antoinette. The 2nd of June, 1953. A day that was meant to be the ultimate display of British tradition, a day of thunderous organ music, heavy gold robes, and the weight of 1,000 years of history pressing down on the shoulders of a young queen. Outside the walls of Westminster Abbey, the rain was falling steadily on the crowds, a grey, misty London morning. But inside, the air was thick with the scent of incense, old stone, and the quiet tension of an empire in transition. While the eyes of the world were fixed on the new Queen Elizabeth, a much smaller, much more private drama was unfolding in the shadows of the royal box. Princess Margaret sat there, a vision of youthful grace in her white lace dress, her eyes bright despite the long hours of ceremony. And not far from her, standing with the steady posture of a veteran, was Group Captain Peter Townsend. To the millions watching on their flickering black and white television sets, it was a day of national pride. But for Margaret and Peter, it was a day of excruciating proximity. They were in the same room, breathing the same air, surrounded by the very people who were determined to keep them apart. The ceremony was long, hours of prayers, oaths, and the slow, rhythmic movement of the clergy. It was a boring, repetitive ritual for those who didn't understand the power of the symbols being moved across the stage. But then, it happened. A moment so brief, so fleeting, that most people missed it entirely. In a quiet interval, as the procession was moving, Princess Margaret reached out. It was a gesture of pure instinct. She saw a tiny piece of fluff, a stray bit of lint, on the lapel of Peter Townsend's uniform. And with a gentle, almost domestic flick of her gloved hand, she brushed it away. That was it. Just a second of contact. But in the world of the 1950s royalty, that single second was a thunderclap. It was a gesture of such familiarity, such intimacy, that it shattered the glass wall between the royal family and the staff. You see, a princess does not brush lint off the coat of an employee. A woman brushes lint off the coat of a man she loves. The silence of the abbey seemed to deepen in that moment for those who saw it. The journalists in the press gallery, the sharp-eyed courtiers, the gossips of high society, they all felt the shift in the atmosphere. They realized that the rumors weren't just rumors. Behind the stiff poses and the formal titles, there was a real, beating heart that refused to follow the script. Imagine the internal world of Margaret in that moment. The boredom of the hours-long ceremony suddenly replaced by the electric thrill of a simple touch. She wasn't thinking of the photographers, she wasn't thinking of the constitutional crisis she was about to ignite. She was simply looking at the man who had been her rock during the grief of her father's death. She was looking at the person who made her feel safe in a world that felt increasingly cold and public. After the ceremony, the royals returned to the palace. The balcony appearance followed, the waving crowds, the flight past of the Royal Air Force. But behind the scenes, the air was turning cold. The silent scandal was already moving through the wires of the newsrooms. The fluff on the uniform had become the lead story for the next day's papers. Margaret returned to her private quarters, the heavy silk of her dress rustling against the floorboards. She must have felt the weight of what she had done. A moment of honesty in a day built on performance. Peter, too, knew the price of that moment. He was a man of honor, a man who understood duty, yet he had allowed himself to be the center of a storm that could destroy the very institution he served. Think of the night that followed the coronation. While London celebrated in the streets, while fireworks burst over the Thames, the palace was a place of hushed voices and closed doors. The grey men, the advisors, were already meeting. They were looking at the footage, they were reading the early drafts of the morning columns. They knew that the boring tradition of the crown was being threatened by the most dangerous thing in the world, a genuine human emotion. Margaret's life would never be the same after that day. The coronation was supposed to be her sister's beginning, but for Margaret, it was the beginning of the end of her privacy. Every smile, every glance, every quiet conversation in the gardens would now be scrutinized. She had broken the silence, and now the world would never stop talking. As you drift closer to sleep, imagine the quiet of the abbey after the crowds have left. The smell of the extinguished candles, the shadows stretching across the ancient tombs of kings and queens. Think of how many secrets those stones have kept over the centuries. Margaret's secret was just one more layer of dust on the history of the crown. The quietness of the scandal is what made it so haunting. There were no shouting matches, no public displays of anger. Just a brush of a hand, and a life forever changed. It reminds us that the biggest shifts in our lives often happen in the quietest moments. Not in the storms, but in the gentle breeze of a choice made in secret. Now, let the image of the abbey fade. Let the grey London rain wash away the memory of the lace and the velvet. We are moving away from the 20th century now, drifting further back into the fog of time. We are leaving behind the world of cameras and newspapers, and entering a world of handwritten letters and candlelit masks. We are crossing the English Channel, traveling across the fields of France, to the gates of a palace that was once the center of the universe. Versailles. Here, the scandals weren't just about fluff on a uniform. They were about diamonds and necklaces, and a queen who was lost in a sea of luxury and loneliness. The air here is different. It is heavy with the scent of jasmine and the weight of an approaching revolution. Let your breathing stay slow and steady. We are about to meet Marie Antoinette, a woman who knew better than anyone that the price of a crown is a heart that can never truly be at rest. The velvet echoes of the coronation had barely faded, and the confetti in the London streets was still being swept away, when the quiet world of Princess Margaret began to collide with the immovable walls of the British Constitution. It is a strange thing to think about, how a young woman's heart could become a matter of state, a crisis discussed in the hushed rooms of Parliament and the cold, stone halls of Lambeth Palace. But in the summer of 1953, Margaret's love for Peter Townsend was no longer a private secret. It had become a legal, a moral, and a constitutional emergency. To understand the weight of this crisis, we must look at the invisible threads that hold the crown together. The Queen is not just a ruler, she is the defender of the faith. She is the head of the Church of England. And the Church, in those days, was a rigid fortress of tradition. Its laws were written in the ink of centuries past, and its stance on divorce was absolute. Marriage was for life, and a divorced person, as long as their spouse was still living, was seen as someone who had broken a sacred vow. Imagine the atmosphere in the rooms where the gray-haired men in suits and robes gathered. Men like Winston Churchill, a man who had led Britain through the fire of war, now found himself standing in the way of a princess's happiness. And the Archbishop of Canterbury, Geoffrey Fisher, a man who carried the weight of theology on his shoulders. To them, Margaret wasn't just a sister to the Queen. She was a symbol. If the sister of the defender of the faith married a divorced man, what would happen to the moral fabric of the nation? The crisis was not loud. It didn't happen with shouting or protests. It happened in the quiet scratch of pens on parchment, in the long, boring meetings where constitutional lawyers debated the Royal Marriages Act of 1772. An ancient law, created by King George III, that gave the monarch the power to veto the marriages of their descendants. It was a law designed for a different age, yet it held Margaret's life in its cold, parchment grip. Think of Margaret, sitting in her private drawing room, the morning light filtering through the high windows. She was only 22 years old. Around her, the world was changing. Rock and roll was beginning to stir, the old social orders were starting to crumble, but inside the palace, time had stood still. She was told that if she chose Peter, she would be in breach of her duty to the crown. She was told that the government might not support her. She was told that she would have to give up her right of succession, her royal title, and her home. The desperation of this choice is something that is hard to grasp in our modern world. Today, we choose love. But for Margaret, love was a threat to the stability of an entire empire. The Church of England stood like a silent sentinel, refusing to bend. The Archbishop's silence was louder than any sermon. He believed that the purity of the monarchy depended on the strict adherence to religious law. To him, Margaret's heart was a small thing compared to the soul of the Church. As you drift deeper into the stillness of the night, try to imagine the long, silent dinners at the palace. The Queen, torn between her love for her sister and her duty as a monarch. Elizabeth wanted Margaret to be happy, but she was bound by the advice of her ministers. In the British system, the monarch reigns, but the government rules. And the government was clear. They would not allow this marriage to happen without the heaviest of prices. The crisis was a series of delays, a strategy of waiting. Churchill and the advisors hoped that if they sent Peter Townsend away, if they put an ocean between the two lovers, the flame would simply flicker out. They believed that time was the greatest enemy of romance. Peter was sent to Brussels, an exile in everything but name. And Margaret was left in the quiet halls of London, surrounded by people who spoke of duty as if it were a comfort, when to her, it felt like a prison. The constitutional weight of this era is fascinating in its dullness. It was a battle fought in the footnotes of law books. It was a crisis of perception. If the public saw the royals as just like everyone else, would the mystery of the crown disappear? The establishment feared that any crack in the tradition would lead to the eventual collapse of the throne. They were protecting a system, and Margaret was simply a casualty of that protection. There is a particular kind of silence that exists in a palace when a scandal is brewing. It is the silence of servants who know more than they say. It is the silence of family members who avoid each other's eyes across a breakfast table. Margaret lived in that silence for 2 long years. She waited. She hoped that the laws would change, that the church would modernize, that the gray men would find a way to be kind. But the machinery of state is not built for kindness. It is built for endurance. Think of the late-night telephone calls between London and Brussels. The static on the line, the voices of two people trying to hold on to a dream while the world tried to pull them apart. Margaret was learning that the secret love of a royal woman is never truly secret. It is always a public debate. Her life was being discussed by people who had never met her, by bishops who saw her as a theological problem, and by politicians who saw her as a polling statistic. The boredom of her days was perhaps the hardest part. The endless ribbon cuttings, the garden parties where she had to smile and shake hands with strangers, all while her mind was miles away, across the English Channel. Each event was a reminder of what she was being asked to protect. An institution that seemed to have no room for her soul. As the night grows darker around you, feel the weight of those constitutional walls. They were built to last forever. They were made of tradition, law, and a profound fear of change. Margaret was a young woman trying to find a corner of happiness in a fortress that was designed to be cold. The crisis wasn't just about a marriage, it was about the collision of the old world and the new. Eventually, as we know, the walls won. The church and the state remained firm. The law did not bend. And Margaret, exhausted by the waiting and the pressure, gave in to the duty that had been etched into her bones since birth. But the crisis left a scar. A scar on the monarchy, and a scar on the heart of a princess who would never again be the girl she was before the fluff was brushed off that uniform. Now, let the grey halls of Westminster and the sombre offices of Whitehall fade from your mind. Let the voices of the archbishops and the prime ministers grow quiet. We are leaving the 20th century behind, drifting further back into a time when the stakes of a royal scandal were even higher. We are moving away from the world of constitutional law, and into a world where a queen's secret love could lead not just to exile, but to the guillotine. We are traveling to the gilded chambers of Versailles, where a young Austrian girl is about to become the most famous queen in history. Take a long, slow breath. The air is changing. It smells of expensive perfume, powdered wigs, and the faint scent of revolution. We are going to meet Marie Antoinette, and the man she loved in the shadows of a falling empire. The year is 1770. Leave behind the foggy streets of London and the modern struggles of Princess Margaret. We are traveling back across the English Channel, across the borders of time, and into the heart of the most magnificent palace the world has ever known. Versailles. A place of endless mirrors, golden gates, and gardens that stretch as far as the eye can see. But as we walk through these gilded halls, the air feels different. It is heavy with the scent of expensive powder, rosewater, and the cold, sharp sting of judgment. Into this world of rigid etiquette and ancient tradition steps a young girl. She is only 14 years old. Her name is Marie Antonia, but the world will come to know her as Marie Antoinette. She has been sent from her home in Vienna, a sacrifice to the altar of politics. She is the Austrian stranger, a teenage archduchess who has been traded like a piece of fine porcelain to seal a treaty between two empires that have hated each other for generations. Imagine being 14, and being told that you must leave everything you know. Your mother, your siblings, your language, even your clothes. At the border of France, they stripped her of her Austrian garments and dressed her in French silk, a symbolic gesture that she no longer belonged to herself. She was now a property of the French crown. She was to marry the Dauphin, the future Louis XVI, a shy, awkward boy who was just as lost as she was. The Palace of Versailles was not a home. It was a theater. Every moment of a royal's life was a public performance. There was a ritual for waking up, a ritual for eating, even a ritual for going to bed. Dozens of noblewomen would watch the young Marie Antoinette dress in the morning, whispering about the color of her skin, the shape of her hair, and the way she held her chin. To the French court, she was an outsider. An Austrienne. A girl who did not understand the subtle, cruel games of Versailles. The boredom of her new life was suffocating. Imagine the long, slow hours spent sitting for portraits, or listening to endless court gossip that meant nothing to her. Her husband, Louis, was a kind boy, but he was silent and distant. He preferred the company of his locks and his hunting dogs to the company of his young bride. For 7 long years, their marriage remained unconsummated. A fact that was whispered about in every corner of France. The weight of this failure sat heavily on Marie's shoulders. It was a quiet, persistent hum of embarrassment that she could never escape. In this profound loneliness, Marie Antoinette began to search for an escape. She found it in the nightlife of Paris, in the masked balls where she could hide her face and pretend, for just a few hours, that she was not a queen. She found it in the Petit Trianon, her private escape in the gardens, where she could pretend to be a simple country girl, away from the prying eyes of the court. But most importantly, she found it in the eyes of a man who saw her not as a queen, but as a woman. Count Axel von Fersen. A Swedish nobleman, tall, handsome, and just as much an outsider in Versailles as she was. Their first meeting was at a masked ball, a chance encounter in the dark, where they spoke without knowing each other's true identities. When the masks finally came off, a connection had been made that would last a lifetime. A connection that would become the most dangerous secret in the history of the French monarchy. Axel von Fersen was everything Louis was not. He was worldly, he was romantic, and he listened. In the quiet, moonlit gardens of Versailles, away from the flickering candles of the ballroom, they found moments of peace. These were not the loud, dramatic scandals of the gutter press. These were the boring, quiet moments of two souls finding comfort in a world that wanted to tear them apart. Think of the letters they wrote to each other. Thousands of words written in secret code, often using invisible ink or layered meanings. Marie would spend hours in her private chambers, the only sound being the scratch of her quill on parchment. She wrote of her fears, her boredom, and her deep, desperate affection for the one man who didn't want anything from her except her heart. These letters were her lifeline. They were the only things that made the cold, marble floors of Versailles feel a little warmer. As you drift deeper into sleep, imagine the scent of the orange blossoms in the Queen's garden at night. The shadows of the statues stretching across the grass. Marie Antoinette walking slowly, her silk skirts rustling like a whisper against the stone. She is waiting for a shadow to move, for the sound of a familiar footstep. In these moments, she is not the Queen of France. She is just a girl from Vienna, looking for a reason to keep going. The tragedy of Marie Antoinette was that she was never allowed to be simple. The French people, struggling with hunger and poverty, looked at her luxury and saw a villain. They didn't see the lonely teenager who cried herself to sleep. They didn't see the woman who found more joy in a secret letter than in a diamond necklace. They saw Madame Deficit, the woman who was spending the nation's wealth while they had no bread. But inside the palace, the Austrian stranger remained a stranger to the very end. She never truly fit in. She was always the foreigner, the girl who laughed too much, the girl who broke the rules of etiquette to be with her friends. And as the clouds of the revolution began to gather on the horizon, her secret love for Axel von Fersen became her only source of strength. He was the one who would eventually try to save her. He was the one who would plan the famous flight to Varennes, the desperate, midnight escape that almost changed the course of history. But for now, in this part of our journey, let us leave her in the quiet peace of the gardens. Let us leave her in that brief moment of happiness before the world fell apart. The air in Versailles is growing still. The candles are being snuffed out one by one. The noblemen and women have retired to their beds, and the Austrian stranger is finally alone with her thoughts. She looks out the window at the distant lights of Paris, wondering what the future holds, but for tonight, she has her memories. She has the secret knowledge that she is loved. Feel the weight of the silk blankets. Feel the stillness of the room. The history of Marie Antoinette is a long, winding road, and we are only at the beginning. But the heart of the story is always the same. A woman in a crown, looking for a way to be human. Now, let the golden halls of Versailles dissolve into the darkness. Let the smell of the roses and the sound of the fountains fade away. We are moving again, traveling through the cold, snowy forests of the north. We are leaving France behind and heading to the vast, frozen plains of Russia. We are going to meet a woman who did not hide from power, but embraced it. A woman who turned her love affairs into a map of an empire. Catherine the Great. Take a deep, slow breath. The air is getting colder, and the stories are getting even deeper. We are moving into the world of the Russian Tsars. The moon hangs low over the gardens of the Petit Trianon, casting long, silver shadows across the manicured lawns and the silent fountains. Here, in the private sanctuary of Marie Antoinette, away from the suffocating eyes of the Grand Court of Versailles, a secret has been kept for years. It is the secret of a man who was neither French nor a king, yet he held the heart of the most powerful woman in the kingdom. Count Axel von Fersen. A Swedish nobleman, a soldier, and a man whose devotion to a queen would eventually transcend the boundaries of duty and life itself. Axel von Fersen was a man of the north, possessing a quiet, brooding energy that stood in stark contrast to the loud, performative decadence of the French aristocracy. He first appeared at the French court as a young man, during his grand tour of Europe. It was at a masked ball in Paris, a whirlwind of silk, lace, and hidden identities, where he first encountered the Dauphin. They spoke in the dark, shielded by their masks, two strangers finding a strange, immediate comfort in each other's voices. When the masks were finally lifted, a connection had been forged that no royal decree could ever undo. Imagine the boredom of the Queen's daily life, the endless ceremonies, the repetitive whispers of the courtiers, and then, the arrival of von Fersen. To Marie Antoinette, he was a breath of cold, fresh air from the Swedish forests. He didn't want her influence, he didn't want her gold, he simply wanted her. He saw the woman beneath the powdered wig and the diamond-encrusted bodice. He saw the girl who was lonely, the girl who was misunderstood, and the girl who was desperately searching for a place to belong. Their relationship was one of shadows and whispers. It was a boring, slow-burning fire that was kept hidden behind the heavy tapestry of palace life. Fersen was often away, serving in the American Revolutionary War, fighting for ideals of liberty, while his heart remained anchored to a palace that was the very symbol of monarchy. During his years away, the letters were their only bridge. Thousands of pages were exchanged, written in complex codes and invisible inks, secrets buried within secrets. Imagine the Queen in her private library, the only sound being the flicker of a single candle and the rhythmic scratch of her quill. She wrote to him not as a sovereign, but as a soul in distress. "I live only to love you," she once whispered through her ink. And Fersen, in his military camps across the ocean, would read those words until the paper frayed at the edges. He was her grand friend, a title that disguised a love so deep it was dangerous to name. When Fersen returned to France, he was no longer just a visitor. He became a fixture of the Queen's inner circle, a silent guardian who watched over her as the political climate of France began to sour. The French people were hungry, the air was thick with the smell of unrest, but inside the Petit Trianon, Fersen and Marie Antoinette created a world of their own. They spent hours walking in the twilight, speaking of music, of philosophy, and of the simple peace that seemed to be slipping through their fingers. The Swedish secret was not a loud scandal of the streets, it was a quiet understanding. Even King Louis XVI, in his gentle, observant way, seemed to accept Fersen's presence. Perhaps the king understood that Fersen provided a happiness that he himself could not give. It was a strange, silent arrangement, a triangle of duty, respect, and forbidden affection that existed in the hushed rooms of the palace. As you drift closer to the edge of sleep, imagine the sound of Fersen's boots on the gravel paths of Versailles. A steady, rhythmic sound that brought a sense of order to the Queen's chaotic world. He was the man who would later organize the carriage for their escape, the man who would drive them through the night toward the border, risking his own life to save the woman he loved. But even that night, the flight to Varennes was a series of long, boring hours spent in a cramped carriage, waiting for a destiny that would never arrive. Fersen never married. He remained a bachelor, his life a monument to a queen who would eventually be taken by the guillotine. Long after Marie Antoinette was gone, Fersen lived in a world of memories. He kept her letters, he kept her portraits, and he kept the silence. He was a man who lived 100 lives, but his heart never left that masked ball in Paris. The tragedy of Axel von Fersen is the tragedy of a man who loved an icon. He loved a woman who belonged to history, a woman whose every breath was a matter of state. To love her was to love a ghost, to love a secret that could never be told in the light of day. Their story is a reminder that even in the most rigid of hierarchies, the human heart will find a way to wander, to find a companion in the dark. Feel the stillness of the Swedish winter in Fersen's soul. Feel the warmth of the French summer in Marie's letters. The two worlds collided in a quiet, boring elegance that defines the secret scandals of the crown. It wasn't about the noise, it was about the silence between the words. It was about the way he looked at her when no one else was watching. Now, let the image of the Swedish count and his golden queen fade into the mists of time. Let the sound of the carriage wheels and the rustle of coded letters grow faint. We are moving away from the tragedy of France, leaving the perfume and the revolution behind. We are traveling to a different kind of court, one where the scandals were tied to a necklace of diamonds that held the power to destroy a kingdom. Take a deep, slow breath. The air is getting heavier, filled with the scent of ancient dust and forgotten jewels. We are moving toward the mystery of the diamond necklace, a story where perception became more powerful than the truth. The night is long, and the history is deep. Rest your eyes, and let the stories carry you further into the shadows of the past. The candles are burning low in the corridors of Versailles, and the air is thick with the scent of old wood, floor wax, and something far more dangerous, the scent of a lie. We have talked about the secret love of Marie Antoinette, the quiet, genuine connection she shared with Axel von Fersen. But now, we must look at a different kind of scandal. A scandal where there was no love, only greed, and the terrifying power of perception. The diamond necklace affair. This is not a story of what happened, but of what the world believed happened. And in the world of royalty, what people believe is often more important than the truth. Imagine a necklace, but not just any piece of jewelry. Imagine a piece of art so heavy with diamonds that it looks like a shimmering harness of ice. 647 diamonds. Nearly 3,000 carats. It was created by the finest jewelers in Paris for Madame du Barry, the mistress of the previous king. But the king died, and the jewelers were left with a masterpiece that no one could afford. It was a boring, stagnant treasure, sitting in a velvet box, waiting for a tragedy to give it life. At the center of this web was a woman named Jeanne de Valois Saint-Remy. A woman of ancient blood but empty pockets, a master of the slow, patient con. She whispered into the ears of the powerful, telling them that she was a close friend of the queen. It was a lie. Marie Antoinette didn't even know she existed. But Jeanne knew that in the halls of Versailles, a whisper travels faster than a fact. She found her target in Cardinal de Rohan, a man of the church who was desperate to regain the queen's favor. Jeanne convinced the cardinal that the queen secretly desired the diamond necklace, but could not buy it openly because of the nation's poverty. She forged letters. She hired a prostitute who looked like the queen to meet the cardinal in a dark garden for a few seconds of whispered promises. Think of that night, the damp grass, the smell of roses, and the cardinal bowing to a woman in a blue dress, believing he was speaking to the sovereign of France. It was a performance of shadows, a masterpiece of perception. The cardinal bought the necklace on credit, handing it over to Jeanne, believing she would deliver it to the queen. Instead, the diamonds were pried out of their settings and sold on the black markets of London. When the jewelers finally asked the queen for payment, the silence was deafening. Marie Antoinette knew nothing. The cardinal realized he had been played. And the public, already hungry and angry, saw only one thing. They saw a queen who was buying diamonds while they were begging for bread. The trial that followed was a long, boring, public dissection of the monarchy's dignity. Even though Marie Antoinette was completely innocent of the crime, she was guilty in the eyes of the people. They believed she had used Jeanne to get the necklace. They believed she was a liar, a spendthrift, a woman of excess. Perception had become reality. The diamond necklace affair was the final nail in the coffin of the queen's reputation. It turned her from a woman of fashion into a villain of history. As you drift closer to sleep, imagine the weight of those diamonds. Not as precious stones, but as heavy, cold anchors pulling a throne into the depths of a revolution. The sparkle of the diamonds was a blinding light that prevented anyone from seeing the truth. The truth was that a lonely woman was being blamed for a crime she didn't commit, by a public that had already decided to hate her. Perception is power, and in this case, it was a power that led to the guillotine. The boredom of the courtroom, the endless reading of testimonies, the dry legal arguments, they all served as a backdrop for a tragedy of errors. The necklace itself disappeared into history, scattered across the globe, but the scar it left on the French monarchy was permanent. It showed that a secret, even a fake secret, can destroy an empire if the timing is right. Feel the stillness of the palace once more. The queen sits in her chamber, looking at her empty neck in the mirror. She wears no diamonds, yet she feels the weight of them every day. The whisper of the crowd outside the gates is growing louder. They are no longer whispering about love or fashion. They are whispering about justice. And justice, in the 1780s, was a sharp and cold blade. Now, let the glitter of the diamonds fade away into the darkness. Let the voices of the lawyers and the forged letters dissolve into the mist. We are leaving the tragedy of Marie Antoinette behind, for now. We are traveling further across the timeline, to a place where power was not a cage, but a weapon. We are moving to the vast, cold plains of Russia, to the Winter Palace. We are going to meet a woman who did not hide her heart, but used it to build a nation. Catherine the Great. A woman who understood that in the game of crowns, you must either be the hunter or the prey. Take a deep, slow, rhythmic breath. The air is getting colder, filled with the scent of pine needles and expensive furs. The stories are shifting, from the delicate laces of France to the iron wool of the Russian Tsars. The night is still young, and we have many miles to travel before the dawn. The night of June 20th, 1791. Paris is wrapped in a heavy, uneasy silence. The air is thick with the scent of summer rain and the faint, metallic tang of revolution. Inside the Tuileries Palace, the flickering shadows of the candles dance against the cold, stone walls. This is the night of the ultimate gamble. A secret escape, a final, desperate attempt to reclaim a life that was slipping away. The flight to Varennes. At the center of this midnight drama is not just a king and a queen, but a man whose love was the only engine driving the carriage forward. Count Axel von Fersen. Fersen has spent weeks planning every detail in the absolute silence of his private quarters. The forged passports, the heavy, customized carriage, the secret routes through the dark forests of France. To the outside world, he was just a Swedish nobleman, a quiet observer of the chaos. But in the dark, he was the architect of hope. Imagine the boredom of the waiting, the long, agonizing hours as the clock in the palace hallway ticked away the seconds. Every tick a heartbeat. Every shadow a potential soldier. One by one, the royal family slips out of the palace in disguise. The Queen. Marie Antoinette, dressed in a simple gray dress and a plain hat, pretending to be a governess. The King. Louis XVI, disguised as a valet. They move through the dark streets of Paris like ghosts, avoiding the patrols of the National Guard. Fersen is there, waiting in the shadows with a small, inconspicuous carriage. He is the coachman, his hands steady on the reins, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. The first few hours are a blur of rhythmic hooves on cobblestones. The sound is repetitive, hypnotic, a boring, steady pulse in the dead of night. Clop, clop, clop. Inside the carriage, the air is hot and cramped. The royal children are sleeping, their heads resting on the velvet cushions, unaware that their world is being dismantled with every mile. Marie Antoinette sits in the dark, her eyes meeting Fersen's for a brief, silent second as he checks the harness. It is a look of total trust. A look of love's last escape. As the city of Paris fades behind them, they reach the outskirts where a larger, more comfortable carriage is waiting. This is where Fersen must leave them. The king insists on it, fearing that Fersen's presence will make them too recognizable. Imagine the quiet tragedy of that moment. Standing on a dark, dusty road, the smell of damp earth and horses. Fersen says, "Goodbye," to the woman he has dedicated his life to protecting. He watches the carriage pull away, the sound of the wheels growing fainter and fainter until it is nothing but a whisper in the wind. The journey continues for 24 long, boring, exhausting hours. The carriage moves slowly, too slowly. It is a massive, heavy vehicle, of Berlin, that draws attention at every village. Inside, the tension is a physical weight. The king, lulled by the rhythmic motion, begins to feel a false sense of security. He eats a simple meal of cold meat and bread, watching the French countryside roll past the window. He thinks they are safe. He thinks the people still love him. He does not realize that the perception of the crown has changed forever. At every stop for fresh horses, the danger grows. The heat of the June sun beats down on the roof of the carriage. The dust from the road clogs their throats. It is a journey of endurance, a test of nerves. In the town of St. Menaheld, a postmaster named Druitt looks at the man in the valet's clothes and then at the face on a paper assignat. The recognition is instant. But he says nothing. He waits until the carriage leaves, and then he rides through the woods like a demon, taking a shortcut to the next town. Varennes. Varennes is a small, quiet town, a place where nothing ever happens. But on this night, it becomes the stage for the end of a monarchy. The carriage is stopped at a bridge. The local authorities are called. There is no violence, no shouting. Just a long, boring period of waiting in an upstairs room of a grocery store. The king sits in a chair, drinking a glass of Burgundy wine, still believing he can talk his way out of this. The queen sits by the window, her hair, it is said, turning white from the stress of those few hours. The sunrise over Varennes is cold and grey. The dream of escape is over. The National Guard arrives, not to rescue them, but to escort them back to Paris as prisoners. The return journey is a nightmare of heat, dust, and insults from the crowds that line the roads. But for Fersen, waiting at the border, the news is a death sentence of the heart. He has failed. The secret love that fueled the escape has led them back to the cage. As you drift further into sleep, think of that long, dark road to Varennes. Think of the sound of the wheels turning, over and over, a circular motion that led nowhere. History is often made of these long stretches of waiting, of plans that fall apart in the quietest of ways. The flight to Varennes was the moment the mask truly fell off. It was the moment the people realized their king was trying to leave them, and the moment Marie Antoinette realized that even love could not save her from the tide of time. Feel the stillness of the room you are in. Let the rhythm of the carriage wheels become the rhythm of your breathing. In and out. The tragedy of the French queen is reaching its final chapters. The jewels are gone, the lovers are separated, and the revolution is knocking at the door. Now, let the dusty roads of France and the grey light of Varennes fade into the shadows. We are leaving the 18th century behind, leaving the guillotine and the silk dresses. We are traveling east, across the mountains, to the vast, imperial palaces of Russia. We are going to meet a woman who understood power better than any queen of France. A woman who turned her secret loves into a foundation for a modern empire. Catherine the Great. The air is getting colder, and the palaces are getting larger. Take a long, slow, deep breath. The scent of the Russian winter is in the air. We have many more stories to tell before the sun rises. Leave behind the dusty roads of France and the tragic echoes of Marie Antoinette. We are moving east, far to the north, where the winter lasts for 6 months and the palaces are built of cold, blue marble and gold. We are entering the world of the Russian Empire, a land of vast, frozen plains and endless forests. And at the heart of this empire sits a woman who was not born to a throne, but who took it with the sheer force of her will. Catherine the Great. Unlike the women we have met before, Catherine did not let her secret loves destroy her. She used them. She turned romance into a form of government, and her heart became the compass of a nation. Catherine was born Sophia, a minor German princess with no wealth and very little prospects. She was brought to Russia as a teenager to marry the heir to the throne. Peter III. Imagine the boredom and the isolation of those early years. A young girl in a foreign land, married to a man who preferred playing with toy soldiers to speaking with his wife. For years, she sat in the quiet rooms of the Winter Palace, reading philosophy, studying the Russian language, and realizing that if she wanted to survive, she would have to find allies. She would have to find love, not just for pleasure, but for power. Her first secret lover was Sergei Saltykov, a handsome courtier who gave her the affection her husband could not. But in the Russian court, a lover was never just a lover. He was a political move. Catherine understood that in the game of crowns, loneliness is a weakness. She surrounded herself with men of talent, men of ambition, and men of loyalty. She didn't hide in the shadows like Marie Antoinette. She invited the shadows into her chamber and made them her advisors. Then came Grigory Orlov. A soldier, a man of action, a man who helped her lead the coup that would eventually remove her husband from power and place the crown upon her own head. Imagine the tension of those nights, the hushed conversations in the barracks, the smell of leather and gunpowder, and Catherine, standing tall in a military uniform, her eyes fixed on the future. Orlov was not just her lover, he was her protector. And when she finally became empress, he was the man who stood by her side as she began to modernize a medieval empire. To the outside world, Catherine's long list of lovers was a scandal. But to Catherine, it was a management style. She looked for men who could serve Russia. When she was bored with one, she would dismiss them with a generous gift of land and serfs, and move on to the next. It was a rhythmic, predictable cycle. A boring, administrative approach to passion. She was the master of her own heart, never allowing a man to rule her, only to support her. As you drift deeper into the stillness of the night, imagine the Winter Palace during a Russian blizzard. The wind howling outside the thick, stone walls, the snow piling up against the windows. Inside, the rooms are heated by massive porcelain stoves. The air is dry and warm, smelling of beeswax and old books. Catherine sits at her desk, writing letters to the greatest thinkers of Europe, Voltaire and Diderot. She is a woman of the Enlightenment, even as she rules with an iron fist. Her lovers were the bridge between her private desires and her public duty. The most significant of these men was Grigory Potemkin. Their love was not just a scandal, it was a partnership that changed the map of the world. Potemkin was a visionary, a man who shared Catherine's dream of expanding Russia to the south. Even after their physical romance ended, their intellectual and political bond remained unbreakable. They were like two halves of a single mind. He was the one who built the cities, he was the one who conquered the Crimea, all in the name of the woman he loved. Think of the letters they exchanged. They weren't just love letters, they were strategic documents. They spoke of naval fleets and diplomatic treaties in the same breath as they spoke of their longing for each other. It was a romance of the mind, a slow, steady, boring accumulation of power. Catherine knew that by giving Potemkin power, she was securing her own. She turned her secret love into a public triumph. In her later years, Catherine's lovers became younger, and the court gossip grew louder. But she didn't care. She was the empress. She had outlived her enemies, she had outgoverned her predecessors, and she had done it all on her own terms. Her heart was a tool, a weapon, and a sanctuary. She showed the world that a royal woman could have both power and passion, provided she was strong enough to keep them in balance. The silence of the Russian night is a heavy thing. It is a silence that covers thousands of miles of wilderness. Catherine lived in that silence. She mastered it. She understood that power is the ultimate romance. It is a commitment that lasts longer than any human life. As she grew old, she looked back on her lovers not with regret, but with the satisfaction of a builder looking at a finished palace. Each man had been a brick, a pillar, a part of the structure of her life. Now, let the cold winds of St. Petersburg and the golden halls of the Winter Palace fade from your mind. Let the sound of the Russian bells and the crackle of the porcelain stoves grow quiet. We are leaving the era of the great empress, moving back to the south, back to the ancient world. We are traveling to a place where the sun is hot, and the scandals are buried in the sands of time. To the land of the Nile. To the court of a woman who used her beauty and her intellect to hold back the might of Rome. Cleopatra. Take a long, slow, rhythmic breath. The air is getting warmer, smelling of incense and Nile mud. The stories are shifting again, from the frozen north to the golden warmth of Egypt. The night is still with us, and the secrets are waiting to be told. The winter in St. Petersburg has a way of silencing the world, a thick, white blanket of snow that muffles the sound of carriages and the footsteps of soldiers. Inside the Winter Palace, the air is still, heated by the soft glow of 1,000 beeswax candles and the steady warmth of the great tile stoves. We have talked about Catherine the Great as a woman of power, a woman who used her heart as a map. But to understand the true depth of her soul, we must talk about the man who was more than a lover, more than a soldier, and more than a secret. Grigory Potemkin. He was the co-ruler of her heart, and the silent architect of her greatest dreams. Potemkin was not like the other men at court. He was a man of contrasts, towering and brilliant, yet often brooding and deeply insecure. He was a soldier with the soul of a poet, a man who could discuss the movement of naval fleets and the finer points of orthodox theology in the same breath. When he first entered Catherine's inner circle, he did not come with the polished grace of a diplomat. He came with a raw, undeniable energy that captured the Empress's attention. It was a connection that was not built on the fleeting spark of a masked ball, but on a slow, boring, and profound intellectual recognition. Imagine the private studies of the palace, where the only sound is the rhythmic crackle of the fire and the rustle of maps being spread across a mahogany table. This is where their love grew. It was a love of the mind, a partnership of two giants who realized that together, they could reshape the world. Catherine called him her twin soul, her lion of the jungle. They spoke a language that no one else at court understood, a mix of affection, strategy, and shared ambition. Even in their most intimate moments, the shadow of the Russian Empire was always present. Their romance was a whirlwind that eventually settled into something much deeper, and much more permanent. As the years passed, the physical fire of their relationship began to fade into a steady, glowing ember of mutual respect. In any other royal court, this would have been the end of the scandal. The lover would have been dismissed, replaced by a younger, fresher face. But Catherine and Potemkin were different. They realized that their bond was too valuable to be broken by something as simple as the passing of time. They made a secret pact, an arrangement that allowed them to remain partners even as their private lives moved in different directions. Potemkin moved to the south, to the wild, unsettled lands of the Crimea, but he never truly left Catherine's side. He became her eyes and ears in the distance. He built cities where there were only ruins, he founded naval bases where there were only quiet bays. And every step of the way, he wrote to her. Imagine the long, boring, dusty road from the Black Sea to St. Petersburg, and the messengers carrying letters that were filled with both love and military intelligence. Catherine would wait for these letters with the same hunger she had once felt for his touch. Potemkin was the man who created the Potemkin villages, a term that history has often used to mock him, but in reality, it was a testament to his desire to please his empress. He wanted to show her a Russia that was thriving, a Russia that was beautiful, even if it was a work in progress. He was the producer of her glory, the man behind the curtain who made sure the world saw Catherine as the magnificent ruler she was. Their relationship was the ultimate secret scandal because it defied the rules of how a queen should behave. She didn't discard him, she elevated him. Think of the silence of the Russian steppe at night, the vastness of the horizon, and Potemkin sitting in his tent, staring at a portrait of Catherine. He was a man who had everything, yet he lived for the approval of one woman. And in the Winter Palace, Catherine sat at her window, looking toward the south, knowing that her empire was safe because of the man she had once loved in secret. It was a boring, administrative kind of devotion, the kind that builds roads and wins wars, but it was the most powerful love she would ever know. When Potemkin eventually passed away on a lonely road in the middle of a journey, Catherine was devastated. It was the only time the court saw her truly broken. She said that she had lost her right hand, her other self. The secret scandal of their partnership had lasted for decades, surviving distance, aging, and the arrival of other lovers. It showed that for a royal woman, the most scandalous thing of all is not a fleeting affair, but a lasting, equal partnership that threatens the traditional power of men. As you drift deeper into sleep, let the cold, imperial grandeur of Russia fade away. Let the sound of the wind across the steppe and the smell of the porcelain stoves dissolve into the darkness. We are leaving the world of the Tsars, leaving the snow and the iron wool of Catherine. We are moving back toward the warmth of the Mediterranean, toward an even older empire. We are traveling to the ancient sands of Egypt, where the air is thick with the scent of lotus flowers and Nile mud. We are going to meet a woman who was a legend before she was even a queen. A woman who used the power of her mind and the mystery of her beauty to hold the entire Roman Empire at bay. Cleopatra. Take a long, slow, rhythmic breath. The air is getting warmer, heavier, smelling of incense and ancient secrets. The stories are shifting, from the cold, blue marble of Russia to the sun-drenched stone of Alexandria. The night is still with us, and we have many more secrets to uncover. Leaving the vast, frozen plains of Russia and the cold marble of the Winter Palace behind, we travel back across the map, and back through the centuries, to an island shrouded in mist and ancient tradition. England. But we are going back further than the days of Princess Margaret, back to the 16th century, to a court of heavy oak, flickering torchlight, and the sharp, dangerous scent of rosemary and damp stone. We are entering the world of the Tudors, a time when a king's whim was law, and a woman's love could be a death sentence. We are going to talk about Anne Boleyn, the woman who changed the world with a glance, only to find that the heart she won was as fickle as the wind. This is the story of a tragedy written in whispers, and ended with 11 words. Anne Boleyn was not a passive observer of history. She was a spark in a room full of dry tinder. When she first arrived at the court of Henry VIII, she was different from the other women. She had been educated in the sophisticated courts of France and the Netherlands. She carried herself with a quiet, continental grace, and she possessed a sharp, intellectual wit that fascinated the king. Henry was used to getting what he wanted, and he wanted Anne. But Anne was not interested in being just another secret in a long line of mistresses. She wanted the crown. And so began a boring, long, 7-year game of cat and mouse, a slow-motion scandal that would eventually break the power of the Pope in England. Imagine the quiet library of a Tudor manor, the smell of old parchment and the sound of a quill scratching by candlelight. Henry wrote her letters that were filled with a desperate, almost adolescent longing. He spoke of his loneliness, of his pain, of how his heart was wounded by her refusal. These letters were the secret fuel for a fire that would consume a kingdom. For 7 long years, they waited. 7 years of legal debates, 7 years of religious arguments, 7 years of quiet meetings in garden galleries where they spoke of a future that felt just out of reach. And was a woman who understood the power of no. She knew that by withholding herself, she was making herself more valuable in the eyes of a king who had never been denied. But this was a dangerous game. The longer it took for Henry to win her, the more enemies and gathered in the shadows. To the common people, she was the night crow, the other woman who was tearing the king away from his beloved Queen Catherine of Aragon. They didn't see the woman who sat in her chambers, reading forbidden books and dreaming of a reformed church. They saw a scandal that was threatening the very peace of the realm. Eventually, the break was made. Henry declared himself the head of the church, the marriage to Catherine was annulled, and Anne finally achieved her dream. She was crowned Queen of England. But the tragedy of Anne Boleyn is that the moment she reached the top, the descent began. The secret love that had been so vibrant and electric when it was forbidden, began to grow cold under the heavy pressure of the crown. The king wanted a son, an heir to secure his legacy. And when Anne provided a daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth, the shadows began to close in. Think of the silence of Greenwich Palace in the spring of 1536. The air is sweet with the smell of hawthorn, but inside the stone walls, the atmosphere is suffocating. Anne's wit, which Henry had once loved, was now seen as arrogance. Her sharp tongue, which had once charmed him, was now an annoyance. The king's eyes had already begun to wander toward a quiet, pale girl named Jane Seymour. The machinery of the court, which had once worked to bring into power, was now working to destroy her. The tragedy was not a single event, it was a slow, boring accumulation of lies. Anne was accused of things that were impossible, of secrets that were as dark as they were false. She was trapped in a web of legal technicalities, a trial that was a performance of cruelty. Thomas Cromwell, the king's advisor, was the architect of her downfall. He gathered whispers from the hallways and turned them into testimonies. He took the laughter of a courtier and turned it into evidence of treason. Then came the 11 words. The words that sealed her fate. On the day of her execution, as she stood upon the scaffold in the Tower of London, and did not scream, she did not beg. She spoke with a quiet, regal dignity that silenced the crowd. But the true tragedy lay in the 11 words the King's Council used to describe her crimes in the formal records. Words that were meant to erase her humanity and turn her into a footnote of royal excess. Imagine the Tower of London at dawn. The river mist rising from the Thames, the sound of the axe being sharpened in the distance. Anne Boleyn, who had once been the center of the world, was now a woman alone. The secret love that had started it all had become a nightmare. The crown she had fought for was now just a weight she was about to lay down. She forgave her executioner, she prayed for the king, and in that final moment, she was more of a queen than she had ever been on the throne. The silence after the axe fell was the silence of a kingdom in shock. Henry VIII was already planning his next wedding, trying to forget the woman who had cost him his soul. But Anne could not be forgotten. Her legacy lived on in her daughter, Elizabeth, who would go on to be one of the greatest monarchs the world has ever seen. The secret scandal of Anne Boleyn was not just about a king's lust, it was about a woman who dared to think she could control her own destiny in a world of men. As you drift closer to sleep, let the sound of the Tudor trumpets and the scratch of the quills fade into the darkness. Feel the cold stone of the tower and the damp air of the river. History is full of these echoes, these stories of women who reached for the stars and found only the coldness of the earth. Anne Boleyn's story is a reminder that the price of a crown is often measured in blood. Now, let the grey towers of London dissolve. Let the smell of the rosemary and the sound of the river disappear. We are leaving the 16th century, leaving the Tudors and their dangerous passions. We are traveling further back, across the sea, to the sun-baked stone of a land where the rivers flow with gold. We are going to meet a woman who was a legend before she was a queen. A woman who used the mystery of her beauty and the power of her intellect to hold the entire Roman Empire at bay. Cleopatra. The air is getting warmer, smelling of incense and Nile mud. Take a long, slow, rhythmic breath. The night is still young, and we have many more secrets to uncover. The month of May in the year 1536 did not arrive with the usual brightness of spring. Instead, it brought a cold, suffocating stillness to the court of King Henry VIII. We have talked about the rise of Anne Boleyn, the woman who sparked a revolution for a crown. But now, we must look at the dark, silent machinery of her destruction. This was not a trial of justice, it was a masterpiece of political execution. A boring, systematic dismantling of a human soul that happened within the grey, damp walls of the Tower of London. The injustice of 1536 remains one of the most haunting secrets in the history of the British monarchy. Imagine the atmosphere inside the tower, the smell of wet stone, old wood, and the faint, bitter scent of the River Thames at low tide. Anne Boleyn, who had once been the center of every banquet and the heart of every dance, was now a prisoner in the very rooms she had occupied just before her coronation 3 years earlier. The irony was a heavy, physical weight. She sat by the window, watching the crows circle the battlements, listening to the rhythmic, boring sound of the guards' boots on the cobblestones outside. Each step was a countdown to an end that had already been decided in the quiet offices of Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell was a man of cold logic, a man who understood that if a queen was to be removed, she must be destroyed completely. He did not look for the truth, he manufactured a reality. He gathered whispers from the shadows of the hallways, he twisted the innocent laughter of young musicians into evidence of treason. He took the social conventions of a flirtatious court and turned them into a death warrant. The charges were a list of impossible secrets, of infidelities that defied the laws of time and geography. But in the world of 1536, a king's need for a new wife was more powerful than any fact. The trials themselves were a long, repetitive, and exhausting performance. One by one, The men accused of being her lovers were brought forward. They were men she had known since childhood, men who had served her with loyalty. Some were broken by the threat of torture, others maintained their innocence until the very end. But the result was a foregone conclusion. The jury, made up of the highest nobility in the land, including Anne's own uncle, sat in silence. They did not look at her. They looked at the floor, at the tapestries, at anything but the woman whose life they were about to extinguish. Think of the psychological toll of those days. Anne had to stand before her accusers, her mind sharp, her wit still flashing like a blade, defending herself against lies that were as absurd as they were cruel. She spoke with a calm, regal dignity that unsettled the court. She was not a victim begging for mercy, she was a queen demanding justice. But justice was a ghost that had already left the room. The secret love scandals they accused her of were nothing more than ghosts themselves, smoke used to hide the king's growing desire for Jane Seymour. In the quiet nights between the trial and the execution, the Tower was a place of profound solitude. Anne spent her time in prayer, and in writing. Her quill scratched against the paper in the dead of night, a rhythmic, boring sound that was the only proof of her existence. She knew that the man who had once written her 17 love letters, the man who had torn apart the Catholic Church to marry her, was now waiting impatiently for the sound of a cannon that would signal her death. The betrayal was total. The secret love of the past had become the public execution of the present. The morning of May 19th arrived with a pale, silver light. And dressed with meticulous care, choosing a robe of dark damask and a mantle of ermine. She was a woman who understood the power of the image until the very last second. As she walked toward the scaffold, the crowd was silent. There were no cheers, no jeers, just a heavy, expectant breath. The executioner had been brought specifically from France, a man who used a sword instead of an axe, a mercy granted by a king who still wanted to appear civilized. Anne's final speech was a masterclass in subtlety. She did not blame the king, she did not complain of her fate. To do so would have endangered her daughter, Elizabeth. Instead, she spoke in a low, steady voice, a boring, traditional farewell that masked a heartbreaking injustice. She asked the people to pray for the king, for he was a gentle and sovereign lord. Even in death, she played the role of the perfect queen, a final, silent victory over those who tried to turn her into a common criminal. The sound of the sword was a single, sharp note that ended a decade of history. And then, silence. The cannons fired, the king rode out to hunt, and the name of Anne Boleyn was ordered to be erased from the palace walls. But some secrets cannot be buried. The injustice of 1536 became the foundation of a new era. It proved that a woman's power was a fragile thing, but it also proved that a woman's dignity could survive even the sharpest blade. As you drift deeper into sleep, feel the cold, heavy air of the Tower of London. Let the sound of the river and the rustle of the ermine robe fade into the darkness. The tragedy of the Tudors is a story of blood and stone, a story of how easily the world can turn against those it once adored. But Anne's story is also a story of endurance. A story of a secret love that changed the world, even if it cost the woman her life. Now, let the grey towers of London dissolve into the mist. Let the smell of the damp earth and the sound of the distant bells disappear. We are leaving the 16th century, leaving the swords and the scandals of the English court. We are traveling further back, across the sea, to a land of heat and gold. We are going to meet a woman who was a legend before she was a queen. a woman who used the mystery of her beauty and the power of her intellect to hold the entire Roman Empire at bay. Cleopatra. The air is getting warmer, smelling of incense and Nile mud. Take a long, slow, rhythmic breath. The night is still young, and we have many more secrets to uncover. Leave behind the cold, damp stones of the Tower of London and the tragic echoes of the Tudor court. We are traveling further back in time, crossing oceans and continents, to a land where the sun is a golden weight and the river is a life-giving god. Egypt. But we are not going to the time of the pyramids. We are entering the world of the Ptolemies, a world of Greek sophistication meeting Egyptian mystery. And at the heart of this world sits a woman whose name has become a synonym for beauty, yet her true power lay in something far more enduring. Her mind. Cleopatra 7. The intellectual seductress. For centuries, history has painted Cleopatra as a woman of pure vanity, a seductress who used only her body to captivate the most powerful men of Rome. But this is a boring, narrow view of a woman who was perhaps the most brilliant politician of her age. Imagine a young girl in the great library of Alexandria, the smell of ancient papyrus and the quiet hum of scholars. Cleopatra was not just a queen, she was a linguist who spoke 9 languages. She was a mathematician, a chemist, and a philosopher. She didn't just walk into a room, she mastered it with her intellect. When Cleopatra first encountered Julius Caesar, she was a queen in exile, fighting her own brother for a throne that was rightfully hers. The legend says she was smuggled into the palace inside a rug, a dramatic secret entrance. But think of the boring, quiet conversation that followed. Caesar was a man who had seen everything, a man tired of the sycophants of Rome. In Cleopatra, he found a woman who could discuss the irrigation of the Nile and the poetry of Homer in the same breath. It wasn't just a physical attraction, it was an intellectual alliance. A secret love born out of mutual respect for power and brilliance. Imagine the nights in the Palace of Alexandria, the air thick with the scent of lotus flowers and the heavy, humid warmth of the Nile. Outside, the Roman legions waited in their tents, the rhythmic sound of their spears against their shields a boring, repetitive pulse. But inside, Cleopatra and Caesar sat late into the night, talking. They spoke of the stars, of the future of the Mediterranean, and of how to build an empire that would never fall. This was the true scandal, a woman from the East influencing the master of the West through the sheer force of her personality. Cleopatra understood the power of perception, much like the women we have met before. She knew that to hold Rome at bay, she had to be more than a ruler, she had to be a goddess. She dressed herself in the iconography of Isis, she surrounded herself with the mystery of ancient rituals, but beneath the gold and the incense was a sharp, calculating mind. She used her secret love with Caesar to secure her throne and to protect her people. It was a boring, administrative kind of romance, one that involved tax records, grain shipments, and military treaties. But then, the daggers of the Ides of March changed everything. Caesar was gone, and Cleopatra was once again a woman alone in a dangerous world. She returned to Egypt, to the silence of her palace, watching the horizon for the next storm. And that storm arrived in the form of Mark Antony. If Caesar was her intellectual equal, Antony was her emotional anchor. Their love was louder, more decadent, a scandal that would eventually consume them both. Think of the long, lazy afternoons on the royal barge, the purple silk sails catching the breeze of the Cydnus River. The sound of the water lapping against the hull, a rhythmic, boring sound that masked the political tension of the world outside. Cleopatra didn't just entertain Antony, she curated his reality. She made him believe that Egypt was the center of the world, and that he was its king. It was a masterpiece of psychological seduction, an intellectual game played with the highest stakes. The Roman propaganda machines, led by the cold and calculated Octavian, tried to turn her into a villain. They called her a foreign whore, a witch who had drugged the minds of Rome's greatest generals. They didn't want to admit that a woman could be smarter than them. They wanted to reduce her to a secret scandal of the flesh, because the reality of her intellectual power was too threatening. Cleopatra lived in that tension, a queen fighting a war of words as much as a war of ships. As you drift closer to sleep, imagine the stillness of the temple of Isis at night. The scent of burning Kifi incense, the flickering shadows of the hieroglyphs on the walls. Cleopatra sits there, a woman of two worlds. Greek by blood but Egyptian by spirit. She knows the end is coming. She knows that the Roman fleet is closing in. But she remains calm. She has lived her life on her own terms, using her mind as her greatest weapon and her heart as her final shield. The tragedy of Cleopatra is not that she died for love, but that she died for her kingdom. Her secret love scandals were tools of statecraft, ways to keep her people safe from the crushing weight of Rome. When she eventually chose the path of the ASP, it was a final, intellectual act of defiance. She chose how her story would end. She chose to remain a queen, a goddess, and a mystery that history would never truly solve. Now, let the heat of the Egyptian sun and the smell of the lotus flowers fade away. Let the sound of the Nile and the rustle of the silk sails disappear into the darkness. We are leaving the ancient world behind, leaving the temples and the legends of the Ptolemies. We are traveling forward, across the sea, back to the misty islands of Britain. We are going to meet a woman who was a queen of a different kind. A woman who lived in the glare of the modern world, yet kept her heart a secret until the very end. The people's princess. Diana. Take a long, slow, rhythmic breath. The air is getting cooler, smelling of fresh rain and the English countryside. The night is still with us, and the secrets are waiting to be told. The sun is beginning to set over the Cydnus River, casting a long, amber glow across the water that ripples like liquid gold. We have explored the sharp, calculating mind of Cleopatra, but now, we must witness the ultimate performance of her life. The moment where power and romance became a visual masterpiece. This is the story of the Golden Barge, a secret meeting that was not a scandal of the shadows, but a scandal of the senses. A boring, slow-moving spectacle that would bring the most powerful soldier of Rome to his knees. Imagine the atmosphere in the city of Tarsus. The Roman general Mark Antony is waiting. He is a man of the battlefield, a man of blood and iron, but he is also a man of excess, a man who loves the grand gesture. He has summoned Cleopatra to account for her actions, to prove her loyalty to Rome. But Cleopatra does not arrive like a defeated queen. She does not arrive with excuses. She arrives as a dream. The sound of the barge begins long before it is seen. A rhythmic, repetitive, boring pulse of silver oars hitting the water. Splash, splash, splash. The oars are tipped with silver, and they move in perfect harmony to the sound of flutes and harps. It is a hypnotic sound, a sound that lulls the mind and prepares the soul for something extraordinary. As the barge rounds the bend in the river, the sight is almost too much for the eyes to comprehend. The hull of the ship is covered in beaten gold, reflecting the afternoon sun with a blinding brilliance. The sails are made of royal purple silk, heavy and rich, catching the breeze with a soft, constant rustle. And the scent, it is said the smell of her perfume reached the shore long before the ship itself. A cloud of frankincense, myrrh, and rare spices from the east, drifting across the water like a fragrant fog. This was not just a journey, it was a psychological invasion. Cleopatra sits on a throne under a canopy of gold cloth, dressed not as a politician, but as the goddess Aphrodite. She is surrounded by young boys dressed as cupids, fanning her with large, rhythmic strokes of ostrich feathers. The movement is steady, boring, and mesmerizing. Her beautiful handmaidens, dressed as sea nymphs and graces, stand at the silver oars and the silken ropes. She is the center of a living painting, a goddess emerging from the river to claim her prize. Mark Antony, sitting in the town square, hears the music and smells the perfume. The people of Tarsus begin to leave their houses, drawn to the riverbank by the sheer magnetism of the spectacle. Antony is left alone, the master of Rome, yet suddenly feeling like a small child in the face of such ancient, quiet power. He realizes that he is no longer the one in control. The secret love that would follow was not a conquest for Rome, it was a surrender for Antony. Think of the long, boring, extravagant banquets that followed on the barge that night. The flickering oil lamps casting long shadows against the purple silk. The tables were covered in gold plates, the wine flowed from silver pitchers. But the real feast was the conversation. Cleopatra didn't just entertain him with luxury, she entertained him with her spirit. She joked, she gambled, she drank, and she spoke of a world where Rome and Egypt were not enemies, but a single, magnificent heart. The scandal of the Golden Barge was its sheer visibility. It was a public display of a private seduction. Every Roman soldier on the shore saw their leader falling under the spell of the Egyptian queen. They saw the discipline of Rome being replaced by the decadence of the East. For Antony, the barge was a sanctuary, a place where he could forget the cold politics of the Senate and the constant threat of Octavian. In Cleopatra's arms, on that golden boat, he found a secret world that felt more real than Rome itself. As you drift closer to sleep, imagine the sound of the water against the golden hull in the middle of the night. The barge is anchored in the center of the river, a floating island of light and luxury. The music has faded into a single, soft harp note. The air is still, heavy with the scent of the river and the queen's perfume. Cleopatra and Antony stand at the rail, looking at the stars, unaware that this beautiful night is the beginning of their long, tragic decline. The boredom of the journey back to Alexandria was a dreamlike state. Days spent drifting through the heat of the Mediterranean, a time when the world seemed to stand still. For a royal woman like Cleopatra, the barge was more than a ship, it was a weapon of perception. She had turned a military summons into a romantic triumph. She had ensured that the secret of their love would be told for 2,000 years. Now, let the golden reflection of the water and the purple silk of the sails fade into the darkness. Let the sound of the silver oars and the scent of the incense disappear. We are leaving the ancient world of Egypt, leaving the gods and the queens of the Nile. We are traveling forward again, across the sea, back to the modern era of the 20th century. We are returning to the rainy streets of London, to a palace that is no longer a fortress of gods, but a house under the constant glare of the camera lens. We are going to meet a woman who would become the most photographed person in history, a woman whose secret loves would be splashed across every headline in the world. The People's Princess. Diana. Take a long, slow, rhythmic breath. The air is getting cooler, smelling of fresh rain and old stone. The night is still with us, and we have many more secrets to uncover. Leave behind the golden barges of Egypt and the ancient echoes of the Nile. We are traveling forward through the mists of time, back to the 20th century, to the rain-slicked streets of London and the heavy, grey stone of Kensington Palace. We are entering an era where the secrets of the heart are no longer kept in handwritten letters buried in wooden chests, but are captured by the cold, unblinking lens of the camera. We are going to talk about a woman who was perhaps the most beloved, and the most lonely, figure of the modern age. Diana, the people's princess. A woman whose life was a global fairy tale that slowly dissolved into a quiet, heartbreaking reality. Imagine a young girl, barely 20 years old, standing in the vast, echoing halls of St. Paul's Cathedral in 1981. The world sees the ivory silk dress, the 25-foot train, the diamonds of the Spencer tiara catching the light. It is a moment of pure, boring perfection, a ceremony seen by millions. But as Diana walks down that long, red-carpeted aisle, her eyes are not just on the prince waiting for her at the altar. They are searching the pews. And for a split second, she sees her. Camilla. The third person in the marriage before it had even truly begun. The scandal of Diana was not a sudden explosion, it was a slow, rhythmic erosion of a dream. Behind the polished gates of the palace, the atmosphere was one of profound silence. Imagine the long, boring afternoons in the drawing rooms, the sound of a ticking clock being the only companion to a young woman who had been promised a romance but was given a role. Diana was a girl of the 80s, a girl of emotion and vulnerability, trapped in an institution that valued stiff upper lips and the preservation of tradition above all else. She was the people's princess, but inside her own home, she was a stranger. The third person was a shadow that never left the room. Even on their honeymoon, the ghost of a previous love was present. Imagine the quiet, tension-filled dinners on the royal yacht Britannia, the sound of the waves against the hull, a repetitive, boring pulse that masked the lack of conversation between a husband and a wife. Diana found the photos, she found the cufflinks, she found the secret letters. The realization that her life was a performance for the public, while the real heart of her husband belonged elsewhere, was a weight that slowly began to crush her spirit. In this isolation, Diana began to look for her own sanctuary. She found it in the people. She realized that if she could not find love inside the palace, she would find it in the hands she held in the hospitals, in the eyes of the outcasts she hugged, and in the millions of strangers who saw themselves in her sadness. This was her secret rebellion. She broke the royal protocol not with anger, but with empathy. She showed a world that had become cynical that a princess could bleed, that a princess could cry, and that a princess could be human. But the secret love scandals did not stop there. As the marriage crumbled in the glare of the paparazzi, Diana sought comfort in the shadows. There were whispers of meetings in darkened cars, of secret phone calls, of men who offered her the one thing the crown could not, the feeling of being protected. From the quiet protection of Barry Manicky to the complicated devotion of James Hewitt, Diana was a woman searching for a home for her heart. Each relationship was a desperate attempt to fill the void left by the third person who had always been there. The boredom of the royal routine became a backdrop for a psychological war. Think of the Christmas holidays at Sandringham, the heavy, traditional meals, the rigid schedule of shooting and walking, while the marriage was a hollow shell. Diana and Charles lived separate lives under the same roof, a secret that the world was beginning to guess. The press became the weapon of choice. Every outfit, every smile, every downward glance was analyzed as a coded message in a battle for public sympathy. Then came the moment that changed everything, the panorama interview. In the quiet, dimly lit room, Diana sat before the world and spoke the truth that had been whispered for a decade. There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. Those words were a thunderclap in the silence of British history. It was the moment the secret was no longer a secret. It was a public confession of a private tragedy. The people's princess had torn down the velvet curtain, exposing the cold, boring reality of a royal life without love. As you drift deeper into sleep, imagine the flashbulbs of the cameras, a rhythmic, blinding staccato that followed her every move. Diana lived in a world where there was no privacy, where even her most intimate thoughts were a commodity to be sold. But in the middle of that chaos, she remained a symbol of hope. She was a woman who had been broken, but refused to stay silent. Her secret loves were not just scandals, they were her way of surviving a system that tried to erase her. The stillness of Kensington Palace at night was a lonely thing. Diana walking through the dark hallways, the floorboards creaking under her feet, thinking of the life she could have had. She was a woman who wanted a simple love, but was born into a world of complex duty. The third person eventually became the queen, but Diana became a legend. A legend of the heart that still beats in the memories of millions around the world. Now, let the sound of the London traffic and the flickering light of the cameras fade away. Let the grey stone of the palace and the scent of the English rain dissolve into the darkness. We are moving away from the modern era, leaving the paparazzi and the television screens behind. We are traveling back in time, back to the rugged, wild coasts of America, to a time of colonies and new beginnings. We are going to meet a woman who lived in a world of strict morality, yet followed her heart into a scandal that would define her life. We are moving toward the colonial kitchens and the silent forests of the New World. Take a long, slow, rhythmic breath. The air is getting fresher, smelling of pine needles and wood smoke. The night is still with us, and the secrets are waiting to be told. The year is 1992, and the world is watching. Leave behind the ancient myths of Egypt and the heavy oak of the Tudor courts. We are back in the era of global satellite feeds, high-speed film, and the relentless hum of the printing press. We have talked about Diana as a woman trapped in a marriage of 3, but to truly understand her story, we must talk about the invisible giant that stood between her and the world. The media. For a royal woman in the modern age, the camera lens is a double-edged sword. It can be a shield that protects you, or a blade that cuts you to the bone. And Diana was the first to realize that in the age of information, perception is the only reality that matters. Imagine the silence of a dark room, the only light coming from a television screen or a glowing computer monitor. This was the new battlefield. In the centuries before, a queen's secrets were buried in coded letters or whispered in garden galleries. But for Diana, her secrets were a commodity. A single photograph of her looking sad, a grainy image of her in a car, a recorded phone call caught on a scanner, these were worth millions. The media was a hungry, boring, repetitive machine that required a constant supply of drama to stay alive. And Diana, with her expressive eyes and her tragic heart, was its favorite subject. Think of the paparazzi, a word that sounds like the buzz of an angry insect. They followed her every move, a rhythmic, staccato pulse of motor drives and flashbulbs. Click, click, Click. It was a boring, exhausting shadow that never left her. Whether she was taking her sons to school or visiting a hospice in the middle of the night, the cameras were there. They transformed her private grief into a public spectacle. But Diana was not just a victim of the lens. She was its master. She understood that if the palace would not give her a voice, she would take one through the media. She began to use the double-edged sword to her own advantage. She collaborated with journalists. She leaked her own side of the story to biographers. She chose outfits that sent coded messages to the public. When she was seen walking through a minefield in Angola or hugging a child with AIDS, she was using the power of the image to bypass the royal establishment. She was talking directly to the people, and the people were listening. The media was her weapon in a war of survival, a way to ensure that she could not be erased by the gray men in suits. But a sword that you wield can also turn against you. The more Diana invited the cameras in, the less space she had to breathe. The secret love scandals that were once her private sanctuary were now front-page news. The Squidgegate tapes, the Hewitt headlines, the constant dissection of her mental health. The media that had made her a goddess was now tearing her apart to see what was inside. It was a boring, cruel cycle of elevation and destruction. She lived in a goldfish bowl where the glass was always being tapped by a million fingers. Imagine the long, lonely nights at Kensington Palace, the curtains drawn tight to hide from the long-range lenses across the street. Diana would spend hours on the phone with journalists she thought were her friends, trying to manage the narrative, trying to protect her sons. It was an exhausting, repetitive game of chess played in the dark. Every headline was a move, every interview was a counter-move. The third person in her marriage was not just Camilla, it was the press. It was a constant presence that made intimacy impossible and trust a luxury she could no longer afford. As you drift closer to sleep, imagine the sound of the printing presses in the middle of the night. A heavy, industrial thrum, churning out the morning editions. Thousands of copies of her face, flying across the country in the back of trucks, waiting to be read at breakfast tables. To the readers, it was just a story. A bit of gossip to pass the time. But to the woman in the palace, it was her life being shredded for entertainment. The media had turned her heart into a script, and she was the lead actress in a play that she could not stop. The tragedy of the double-edged sword reached its ultimate, horrific conclusion in a tunnel in Paris. A high-speed chase, the blinding flash of the paparazzi's bulbs, and then silence. Even in her final moments, the cameras did not stop. They had followed her into the dark, and they stayed there until the very end. The media that had loved her, and the media that had hunted her, were now the only witnesses to her departure. The silence after Diana's death was a silence of collective guilt. The world realized that by consuming the scandal, they had fueled the machine that destroyed the woman. For a brief moment, the double-edged sword was laid down. The cameras were stilled, and the newspapers were filled with nothing but flowers and tears. But the lesson had been learned. A royal woman's secret is no longer hers to keep once it enters the digital stream. As you feel the stillness of your own room, let the sound of the cameras and the rustle of the newspapers fade away. The era of the people's princess is a reminder that in the modern world, fame is a cage made of light. Diana's story is the story of a woman who tried to use that light to find her way home, only to be blinded by it. Now, let the grey stone of London and the flickering images of the 1990s dissolve into the darkness. We are leaving the age of television and satellites behind. We are traveling back in time, leaving the modern scandals for a world of simpler, but no less profound, secrets. We are heading back to the early days of a king who chose love over an entire empire. We are going to meet a woman who was seen as a villain by a nation, but was a savior to a man. Wallis Simpson. The American woman who stole a king. Take a long, slow, rhythmic breath. The air is getting cooler, smelling of vintage perfume and sea salt. The night is still with us, and the secrets are waiting to be told. We are leaving behind the flashing bulbs of the 90s and the tragic echoes of Kensington Palace, drifting back through the decades to a time of gramophones, heavy wool coats, and a British Empire that still felt as though it would last forever. The year is 1936. A year of grey London skies and a throne that was about to be shaken by a force no one expected. It wasn't an invading army or a political revolution, it was a woman. An American woman with a sharp wit, a complicated past, and a secret love that would lead to the greatest constitutional crisis of the century. Wallis Simpson. The woman who stole a king. Wallis was not a princess of ancient blood. She was a socialite from Baltimore, a woman who had already been married twice. To the British establishment, she was the ultimate outsider. She was that woman. A person who represented everything the rigid, boring traditions of the monarchy feared. But to King Edward VIII, the man who would be known to his family as David, she was the only person who made him feel alive. In her presence, he wasn't a monarch to be worshipped, he was a man to be loved. Imagine the private parties at Fort Belvedere, the king's secluded country retreat. The air is filled with the scent of pine and expensive gin. Outside, the world is moving toward another great war, but inside, Edward and Wallis created a sanctuary of their own. While the servants moved through the rooms with a quiet, boring efficiency, the king was breaking every rule of his station. He didn't want the crown, he didn't want the responsibility. He wanted the secret world he shared with a woman the world told him he could not have. Their romance was a slow-burning scandal that happened behind closed doors for years before the public knew a single word. Think of the long, silent weekends in the English countryside, the sound of the king's dogs barking in the distance and the rhythmic click of Wallis's heels on the stone terrace. Every moment they spent together was a secret defiance of the church and the state. In 1930s Britain, a king could not marry a divorced woman. It was a law as solid as the stone of Westminster Abbey. But Edward was a man who believed that the heart should rule the head. He was the playboy prince, a man who had always felt the weight of his destiny as a suffocating burden. When his father, King George V, passed away, the secret could no longer be kept. Edward was now king, and Wallis was now the most dangerous woman in the world. The grey men in suits, the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, and the Archbishop of Canterbury watched with a cold, boring persistence. They were waiting for the king to choose. The crisis of 1936 was not loud. It was a battle of letters, meetings, and silent ultimatums. Imagine the king sitting at his desk in Buckingham Palace, the same desk where his ancestors had signed treaties and declared wars. Now, he was being asked to sign away his happiness. He was told that if he married Wallis, he would have to abdicate. He would have to give up the throne, the titles, and the nation he had been born to lead. The silence in those palace rooms must have been deafening. Wallis Simpson was a woman caught in a storm she had not fully intended to start. As the news finally broke and the headlines screamed across the Atlantic, she fled to France to escape the mobs and the judgment. Imagine her sitting in a villa in Cannes, listening to the rhythmic sound of the Mediterranean waves, waiting for a phone call that would change history. She was being blamed for stealing a king, for destroying a 1,000-year-old tradition. But in her letters to Edward, she urged him not to give it all up for her. She knew the price of a crown, and she knew the cost of losing it. On a cold, foggy night in December 1936, the world stopped to listen to the radio. The rhythmic crackle of the broadcast filled living rooms across the globe. King Edward VIII, now just Prince Edward, spoke to his people. In a calm, steady, and strangely boring voice, he delivered the words that would echo through history. I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love. It was the ultimate secret scandal, resolved with a single, heartbreaking choice. The aftermath was a long, quiet exile. They became the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, living in a beautiful house in Paris, forever on the outside looking in. Their lives became a series of long, boring afternoons, cocktail parties, and travels to sun-drenched resorts. They were a couple frozen in time, a monument to a love that had cost an empire. Wallis spent the rest of her life in the shadow of that choice, always the woman who stole the king, never fully accepted, never fully forgiven. As you drift closer to sleep, imagine the silence of their garden in Paris. The smell of the roses and the distant sound of the city. Edward and Wallis sitting together in the twilight, two people who had changed the world just by wanting to be together. Their story is a reminder that even the most powerful men are sometimes just looking for a home. And that for a royal woman, even an American one, the secret love she carries can be the heaviest crown of all. Now, let the vintage music and the sound of the radio static fade away. Let the fog of 1930s London and the gardens of Paris dissolve into the darkness. We are leaving the Duke and Duchess behind, moving toward the final chapters of our journey. We are traveling back into the shadows of history, to a mystery that has never been fully solved. We are heading to the dark, dangerous days of the Second World War, to the rumors that followed Wallis and Edward even into their exile. A story of secrets, spies, and a world on the brink of collapse. Take a long, slow, rhythmic breath. The air is getting colder, smelling of old files and secret ink. The night is still with us, and we have just a few more secrets to uncover before the dawn. Leave behind the romantic sacrifice of the abdication and enter the colder, darker shadows of the 1940s. We are drifting into a time of global conflict, of coded telegrams, and of secrets that were buried so deep they were meant to stay hidden forever. We have talked about Wallis and Edward as a couple who chose love over a throne, but history has another side to their story. A boring, persistent, and deeply troubling mystery that follows them even into the grave. The Nazi connection allegations. This is not a story of romance, but of suspicion, of a world at war, and a royal couple who found themselves in the middle of a dangerous political game. Imagine the atmosphere in the halls of power during the early days of World War II. The gray, flickering light of newsreels, the smell of damp wool and cigarette smoke, and the constant, rhythmic thrum of military machinery. For the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, now living in exile in France, the world was changing faster than they could understand. To the British government, they were a liability. To the German High Command, they were a potential weapon. It was a time of whispers, of secret loves that weren't just about hearts, but about the fate of nations. The allegations begin with a series of quiet meetings and social invitations. Before the war broke out, Edward and Wallis traveled to Germany. Imagine the long, boring train journey across the border, the sound of the wheels on the tracks a steady, repetitive, clack clack, clack clack. They were met with the highest honors, they were shown the new Germany, and most controversially, they were photographed meeting Adolf Hitler at his mountain retreat. To Edward, it was perhaps a diplomatic mission, a way to ensure peace. But to the rest of the world, it looked like a betrayal. Think of the Marburg Files, a collection of top-secret documents discovered by Allied soldiers at the end of the war. These files contained the most scandalous secrets of all, a German plot known as Operation Willy. The plan was as simple as it was terrifying. The Nazis wanted to kidnap the Duke and Duchess, take them to Spain, and once Britain had been conquered, restore Edward to the throne as a puppet king. It was a boring, administrative kind of evil, written in dry, bureaucratic language in the files of the German Foreign Office. The question that has haunted historians for decades is, how much did Edward and Wallis know? Imagine the quiet nights in Lisbon, where they fled after the fall of France. The sound of the Atlantic waves hitting the shore, a rhythmic, hypnotic pulse that masked the sound of spies moving in the shadows. German agents were everywhere, whispering promises, telling the Duke that his brother, the King, was incompetent, and that only he could save Britain from destruction. Was it a secret love for his country that tempted him, or was it a dangerous vanity? Winston Churchill, the man who had once defended Edward during the abdication, was now the man who had to silence him. He saw the danger. He knew that if the former king was seen as a Nazi sympathizer, it could destroy the morale of the British people. He acted with a cold, boring, and decisive hand. He ordered the Duke and Duchess to be sent to the Bahamas, a tiny island chain in the middle of the ocean, far away from the cameras, far away from the spies, and far away from the war. Imagine the boredom of their years in the Bahamas. The heat of the tropical sun, the endless cycle of cocktail parties and charity events, while the rest of the world was burning. For Wallis, it felt like a prison. For Edward, it was a slow, agonizing decline. They were surrounded by rumors that they were still in contact with German agents, that Wallis was a spy, that they were waiting for a German victory so they could return to London in glory. These were the secrets that the British intelligence services were desperately trying to bury. The Nazi connection was a shadow that they could never truly outrun. Even after the war ended, and they returned to their life in Paris, the suspicions remained. Every time a new file was declassified, every time a new memoir was published, the scandal was reopened. It was a boring, persistent, and heavy burden that colored their final years. They were a couple who had once been the symbols of romance, now turned into symbols of caution. As you drift closer to sleep, imagine the archives where these secrets are kept. Long, silent rows of metal shelves, filled with boxes of yellowed paper. Each document is a piece of a puzzle that may never be complete. The truth of what Edward and Wallis believed, of what they said in private when the world wasn't listening, is a secret that went with them to the royal vault at Frogmore. The silence of history is a powerful thing. It covers the mistakes, the betrayals, and the compromises made in the dark. The story of the Nazi connection is a reminder that even the most famous people in the world are often just pawns in a much larger game. It shows us that for a royal woman like Wallis, the secret love she was blamed for was only the beginning of a life lived in the crosshairs of history. Now, let the gray echoes of the 1940s and the shadows of the spies fade away. Let the sound of the ocean and the rhythmic ticking of the palace clocks dissolve into the darkness. We are moving away from the scandals of the 20th century, moving back toward the ancient foundations of power. We are heading back to the medieval courts, to a woman who was a queen of two nations, a woman who lived for nearly a century and saw the world change around her. Eleanor of Aquitaine. A woman who knew that the true secret of power is endurance. Take a long, slow, rhythmic breath. The air is getting colder, smelling of damp stone and old parchment. The night is still with us, and we have just 2 more chapters to explore before the light of the morning arrives. Leave behind the modern spies and the 20th century scandals. We are traveling much further back, crossing the centuries until the world of satellites and television disappears entirely. We are entering the 12th century, a world of cold stone castles, flickering torches, and the rhythmic sound of iron horseshoes on muddy roads. This is the era of the Crusades, of chivalry, and of a woman who was so powerful she became a legend in her own long lifetime. Eleanor of Aquitaine. The rebel queen. A woman who was the Queen of France, then the Queen of England, and the mother of 2 kings. But beneath the crowns was a heart that refused to be managed by the men who sought to control her. Eleanor was born into the sun-drenched lands of Aquitaine, in what is now southern France. It was a land of poets, of troubadours, and of a culture that was far more sophisticated than the cold, grey courts of the north. When she inherited her father's vast lands at the age of 15, she became the most eligible bride in Europe. She was married to Louis VII of France, a man who was more of a monk than a king. Imagine the boredom of the French court for a girl raised in the warmth of the South. The long, silent prayers, the endless fasts, and the grey, damp walls of the Cite Palace in Paris. Eleanor was a fire in a world of cold ash. The first great scandal of her life happened in the Holy Land. During the Second Crusade, Eleanor accompanied her husband to Antioch. Imagine the long, boring, dusty journey across the desert, the rhythmic swaying of the litters, and the heat that seemed to melt the very soul. In the court of her uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, Eleanor found a world that reminded her of home. Whispers began to spread, whispers of a secret love between the queen and her uncle. Whether it was true or not did not matter. The perception of the scandal was enough to break her marriage to the King of France. But Eleanor was not a woman to be discarded. Within weeks of her marriage being annulled, she did something that shocked the world. She married Henry Plantagenet, a man 10 years her junior, the future Henry II of England. This was not just a romance, it was a political earthquake. Together, they created the Angevin Empire, a territory that stretched from the borders of Scotland to the Pyrenees. Imagine the energy of their early years, the constant movement, the boring, administrative work of ruling half of Europe. They were a power couple long before the term existed. But as the years passed, the fire between Eleanor and Henry turned into a cold, bitter war. Henry was a man of restless energy and many mistresses, including the famous Rosamund Clifford, the Fair Rosamund. Eleanor did not sit in the shadows and weep. She retreated to her own lands in Poitiers, creating a court of her own, the court of love, where poets sang of secret passions and noble hearts. But the real rebellion was much deeper. She supported her sons in a revolt against their father. A mother and her children, standing against the king. Henry's revenge was a long, boring, 16-year imprisonment. Imagine Eleanor, the woman who had once traveled to Jerusalem, now confined to the rooms of Salisbury Castle or Winchester. The years turned into a rhythmic cycle of seasons seen through a narrow stone window. Spring rains, summer heat, autumn leaves, and winter frost. For 16 years, the world went on without her. Her secret love now was for her children, and for the freedom she had lost. She sat in the silence, waiting, her spirit as sharp as the day she was born. When Henry finally died, her son, Richard the Lionheart, became king. His first act was to set his mother free. Imagine the moment the heavy iron keys turned in the lock, the sound echoing through the cold stone hallway. Eleanor emerged from her prison at the age of 67, not a broken woman, but a ruler. She governed England while Richard was away at the Crusades. She negotiated his ransom when he was captured. She crossed the Alps in winter at the age of 70 to secure a royal marriage. She was the ultimate survivor. As you drift closer to sleep, imagine the silence of a medieval abbey at night. The scent of beeswax candles and the cold, damp breath of the stone. Eleanor spent her final years at the Abbey of Fontevraud, a place of peace after a century of storms. She lived to be 82, an incredible age for her time. She had outlived her husbands, most of her children, and all of her enemies. She was a rebel until the very last breath, proving that a woman's power is not just in the crown she wears, but in the endurance of her will. The silence of the Abbey is the silence of history itself. It covers the wars, the scandals, and the secret loves of 1,000 years. Eleanor's story is a reminder that the secret of a royal woman is often just her refusal to be forgotten. She was a woman who lived for the world, and the world has never stopped talking about her. Now, let the grey stone of the castles and the sound of the medieval trumpets fade away. Let the smell of the old parchment and the flicker of the torches dissolve into the darkness. We are moving toward the final chapter of our journey. Leaving the queens of the past for a quiet reflection on the silence that connects them all. We are heading back to the beginning, to the hidden price of the crown, and the peace that comes when the stories are finally told. Take a long, slow, rhythmic breath. The air is getting warmer, smelling of the morning mist. The night is almost over, and we have just one more secret to share before the dawn. And so, we reach the end of our journey through the velvet shadows of time. We have traveled from the rain-slicked streets of 1950s London to the golden, sun-drenched banks of the Nile. We have walked through the echoing halls of Versailles and the frozen corridors of the Winter Palace. We have listened to the whispers of queens, princesses, and commoners who became legends. But as the morning mist begins to gather outside your window, and the world prepares to wake, we must talk about the one thing that connects every story we have heard tonight. The silence. The legacy of royal silence. It is the quiet weight that sits beneath every crown, the unspoken price of a name that belongs to history. Imagine a vast, silent library where the books have no titles, and the pages are made of nothing but moonlight and memory. This is where the true history of royal women is kept. Not in the grand textbooks, not in the loud headlines of the newspapers, but in the spaces between the lines. The secret love scandals we have explored tonight were not just gossip. They were attempts to break that silence. They were small, desperate fires lit in the middle of a long, cold night, meant to keep a human soul warm when the weight of the state became too much to bear. For Princess Margaret, the silence was the sacrifice of a lifetime of happiness for the sake of a tradition that was already beginning to crumble. For Marie Antoinette, the silence was the lonely distance between a girl from Vienna and a nation that refused to see her humanity. For Anne Boleyn, it was the silence of the Tower, a silence that was eventually broken only by the sharp note of a sword. And for Diana, the silence was the hollow echo of a marriage of three, a silence she eventually chose to shatter so the world could finally hear her voice. Think of the boring reality of these lives. We often imagine them in moments of high drama, of secret meetings and grand betrayals. But most of a royal life is spent in waiting. Waiting for a ceremony to begin. Waiting for a war to end. Waiting for a husband to return or for a child to be born. It is a life of rhythmic, repetitive duty. A life where the individual is slowly erased by the institution. The secret loves were the only things that belonged truly to them. They were the only parts of their lives that were not property of the crown. As you drift deeper into the final stages of sleep, imagine the long, dark galleries of a palace at night. The portraits on the walls are watching, their painted eyes still holding the secrets they could never tell in life. You can almost hear the rustle of a silk dress, the scratch of a quill, the soft sigh of a woman who is finally alone with her thoughts. These are the ghosts of the royal silence. They are not frightening, they are simply tired. They are looking for the same thing you are looking for right now. Peace. Rest. The freedom to let go of the role and simply be. The legacy of these women is not just a collection of scandals. It is a legacy of endurance. They showed us that no matter how heavy the crown, no matter how thick the palace walls, the human heart cannot be fully tamed. It will always search for a connection. It will always find a way to love, even if that love must live in the shadows. They are the silent architects of our modern understanding of the heart. They taught us that power is nothing without a soul to share it with. Think of the billions of people who have lived and died since the time of Cleopatra. History remembers the names of the few, but the emotions they felt are the same as yours. The loneliness, the longing, the brief, electric thrill of a secret shared in the dark. In this way, you are connected to them. The distance of centuries disappears in the quiet of the night. You are breathing the same air of mystery, and you are seeking the same sanctuary of sleep. The night is almost over now. The stories have been told, the candles have all flickered out, and the palace gates are locked for the dawn. The secret love scandals are once again buried in the dust of the archives. But their echoes remain in the stillness of your room. They are a gentle reminder that every life has its secrets, and every secret has its beauty. You don't have to carry the weight of the world anymore. You don't have to be a king or a queen tonight. Let your body become heavy as the ermine robes we talked about. Let your mind become as still as the waters of the Nile at midnight. The history is done. The kings and queens have retreated to their tombs. The cameras have stopped flashing, and the spies have gone home. There is only the silence now. A kind, healing, and royal silence. You are safe in the dark. The stories have carried you far, but now they are bringing you home. To the quietest place of all. To the dreamless sleep that waits at the end of every journey. The legacy of royal silence is finally yours to share. It is the gift of the night. The gift of forgetting. The gift of rest. Close your eyes. Take one last, long, slow, deep breath. In and out. Good night. Sleep well. And may your dreams be as timeless as the history we have traveled tonight.